I'm going to ask each of you to highlight 2 to 3 key takeaways or insights from the working group that you facilitated. So taking about 5 minutes each. JR, why don't you kick us off with insights from your working session on improving the candidate experience?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. We had a really wonderful working group on this, and I'm happy to be able to share some of the insights back to our broader membership. You know, one of the things that came up was that one of the big results, at least in terms of the world of recruiting, the results of the pandemic has been an increased awareness among companies about the importance of the candidate experience. You know, pre-pandemic, many companies had a clear playbook for how to attract talent and move them through the hiring process. But all that got upended when recruiting went virtual, right? And by having to change the process, it made companies, and by extension candidates, revisit their expectations of what the hiring process should look like. And there were 2 big takeaways that really came through during the course of our discussion. And one is an increased emphasis on continuous communication with candidates, right? Candidates want to know exactly what the hiring process is going to look like, what each of those steps involve, and how long it's going to take to move through the process. So they really want to know the timelines. And among candidates, right, there has been much less tolerance for radio silence and an increased demand and really an expectation for transparency. So they want to know, for example, how many interviews am I going to have to participate in, right, before I know if I got an offer? And if I'm going to have to do 3 interviews, why do I have to do 3 instead of 2? If you're going to ask me to take this particular assessment, why do I need to take it? And why is it so long? And if I'm going to take this assessment, am I going to get the results or some feedback based on that? So candidates are asking a lot more questions of employers, and so that transparency can be really helpful. You know, as I'm sure John is probably going to allude to in sort of the turnover piece, candidates also feel, you know, like as employees do, candidates feel like they have lots of other options. And so they're much less tolerant as they have maybe been in the past for delays. And this idea of sort of ghosting candidates and not letting them know where they stand, or even if their application has been received, is continuously being reflected in negative comments on Glassdoor and other sites. So this idea of continuous communication, expectations, and transparency through the process, I'm calling that one big takeaway, even though I guess it's really several. And the other is a re-emphasis on understanding that onboarding is actually part of the candidate experience, right? This recognition that new hires should really be thought of and treated as candidates for at least their first month on the job, and often up to 3 months, because they're just really starting to understand the organization and the people in the organization. And a small but related point I just want to add is there were a lot of comments in there about recognizing that because things were virtual and you couldn't walk down the hall, that internal hires also needed to be treated as candidates and onboarded into their new roles.
Great. Thanks, JR. Yeah, I'm sure I'm gonna, when we move to John here on sharing insights regarding managing turnover and worker mobility, some of your themes might be repeated. John, what were your insights?
Thanks, Beth, and thanks, JR, for setting this up. I think we had some overlapping content for sure. So I've broken my summary into 3 main buckets here. The first is around just sort of the current context. What are we seeing in companies right now with turnover and mobility? The second is around the causes. So a number of participants talked about the range of reasons why they're seeing this surge in attrition. And then the third category is around interventions, or what companies are doing to try to stem the key losses of talent in this current period. So just some summary points on each of the 3. The first around the current context. It's pretty evident from the Bureau of Labor Statistics data where we are in terms of turnover and attrition. It's the highest since we've begun recording turnover rates through BLS. That said, and it's a theme we heard in the working group, certain industries are more or less affected, right? So if you look at the data broken out by industry in BLS, you'll see hospitality, retail, healthcare, certain sectors with turnover rates that are twice the national average, right? And then there are others that are a little bit more resilient and have been affected a little bit less. So, you know, that was, I think, something that came out of the working group, is that although there's this general rise in attrition, certain sectors and even certain job groups are being affected differentially. I think the other piece of that, just on a sort of a side note, is that with the pandemic, we've had kind of a simultaneous shock to everyone's employment relationship to reconsider their relationship with the employer. And so I think that's something that traditionally happens sporadically, and these events are experienced personally on a more random basis. But I think what we're seeing here is that collectively, everyone is rethinking their current situation and potentially looking for alternatives. So that's a little bit on the context. In terms of causes, maybe we could talk in more detail about some of this later, but intensification of workload, I think, was a key theme amongst companies, especially for HR folks in particular, as one of the key reasons for leaving. A lot of uncertainty and employee mistrust, right? Hearing different things from the organization as far as what's next, as far as what's happening with flexibility or return to office. So some of those issues came up for sure. And I think we have to acknowledge the external labor market is as strong as ever for employees in a lot of domains or a lot of job categories. And so that's another key driver, I think, here. It's not just what's happening internally, but the availability of alternatives in the external market. That said, too, there's all of this pent-up demand that people really weren't moving during the pandemic. And then now that employers are opening up again, you're seeing this rise in attrition. So some of the causes are sort of related and help explain that surge. And the last bucket around interventions, I think it's kind of the classic HR areas, right? So a lot of companies focusing on comp and retention bonuses, pay raises, right? And not on a much quicker timetable is something that I think we heard too, that we're not waiting for the annual review cycle, but more instantaneous and rapid interventions on the comp side. Additional attention to development, right? How are we developing leaders in this new remote work environment so that they're better able to connect with new hires and with existing employees to kind of encourage retention. And then the last piece, just around something that JR mentioned around recruitment messaging and just really emphasizing what we're saying to candidates, how we're messaging opportunities about the organization and the recruitment process was sort of another key theme here, kind of all geared towards we're losing folks at a high rate. So as we bring folks in, let's see if we can do better with retaining new hires, because that was a higher risk group is another point we heard in the discussion. So those are some of the key themes, and I'm sure we'll talk more about them as we go.
Thanks, John. Turning over to you, Brad, John just did mention, the evolving learning and development area, especially in regards to leadership development. What did you find in your working group on that topic?
Yeah, thanks. I think there was a couple important takeaways from the discussion we had around learning and development. And not surprising, a lot of the discussion was about the shift of learning over the past year and a half, largely to kind of virtual, delivery, which has been the case, across the board. And I think what we heard from companies is that's been somewhat of a mixed bag. On the one hand, it's created new opportunities. For example, we heard about programs being able to be expanded to cover audiences across different geographies, internationally. So bringing people together for learning that, generally might have been more siloed as they went through particular programs. We also heard that kind of executive involvement in learning and development has increased because it's much more easier for executives to log on to a session virtually and, participate or share their experiences, as opposed to, when they might have had to go, on site for an in-person program. One of the interesting kind of opportunities that I didn't expect to hear was, talked about it's much easier in the virtual environment to track kind of learners, learning journeys. When in normal times, when a lot of this is occurring, maybe more through social learning or experiential learning, much more difficult to kind of track exactly what learning employees are doing. Obviously, when it's online, it's, we know exactly what people are doing and the kind of sequence of courses they've taken. And that's allowed companies to dig in and look a bit at, what are those successful learning journeys that employees have been on to try to replicate them more broadly. At the same time, there's, certainly challenges with the kind of shift to virtual delivery. One is the loss of social interaction. One participant I thought said it well in the sense of, learning and development was one of those last places where you could pretty much guarantee on interacting with others, right? In a kind of a social sense. And now we don't even have that. So what are the implications of that for, networking? I think to some of the earlier comments by John and JR, for onboarding new employees, if we're doing that virtually, what do we lose with that kind of social interaction, because we know it's not quite the same when we're online or virtual as when we're in person. And we also heard about trainers having to adjust because, engaging participants in the online environment is very different than what they might have done in the past when they're in the classroom or in other settings. So it's created kind of new challenges for trainers as well to kind of adjust their approach. I think the second key burnout, again, which dovetails with some of the earlier themes, is really around the impact of employee burnout on participation in learning and development. John talked about work intensification. And I think as work is intensified, as employees have experienced burnout, companies are finding it harder to engage employees in things like learning and development, right? Particularly if those are kind of voluntary activities. And so I think it's also been compounded, with this shift to virtual learning, because the prospect for any one of us to, log on to yet another kind of virtual online, discussion, is not maybe where we want to spend our time if given the choice. And I think companies are trying to address this in a few different ways. One is really trying to emphasize bite-sized, kind of just-in-time learning, kind of getting away from these really kind of long, extensive programs to how do we make sure that the learning that employees need is available there when they need it and they can consume it as quickly as possible. And maybe that's not a traditional kind of e-learning. Maybe it's just connecting them with a peer that they can, discuss a problem with, so thinking about other, approaches. The second piece is really amping up marketing. I think learning and development at times kind of takes the field of dreams. If you build it, they will come approach. And I think, again, that's not going to work. We really need to be out there making sure employees are aware of the learning, are aware of the benefits of participating in learning, even when they have all these other kind of demands on their time. And the last piece, made somewhat obvious, is really trying to make the content as engaging as possible. So there was a lot of discussion around things like storytelling, learning from peers. So, getting away from maybe the more kind of asynchronous online learning to really create these more engaging learning experiences that draw people in and keep them engaged while going through the programs.
Great. Thanks, Brad. Beck, I'm going to turn to you. Brad was talking about, how to build and maintain engagement in learning and development. What did you find out from companies about overall culture and building and maintaining engagement in this environment?
So yeah, thanks. Several of these themes have also come up, in my session. One of the things that came up was this perception among organizations that employees are really kind of conveying mixed and sometimes what seems like conflicting sentiments. So there's a sense of isolation and burnout and fatigue, lack of community that has developed over the course of the last 18 months. And it seems like much of this is connected to kind of working at home in this isolated remote work environment. And yet at the same time, organizations are facing widespread resistance to return to the office from employees. And so one of the challenges is negotiating how do we reconcile kind of these concerns that we have among employees and their well-being with how do we think about the best way to move forward, both for the organization, but also to address those well-being concerns. A second, somewhat related point, and this certainly came up, I think John mentioned it as well, leading is different in a remote work environment. Being a manager, a people leader has been a different role in the last 18 months. And one of the things organizations are recognizing is just the importance of acknowledging that managers are burned out too. So managers have been dealing with many of the same challenges and changes that employees have in the last 18 months. But in some cases, that intensification has been even greater for them. They're in positions of trying to absorb some of the uncertainty, trying to communicate the right messaging to their employees, while dealing with the burnout and engagement issues that we're seeing among the workforce. So one of the solutions that a couple of participants in my working group shared was while really focusing on attending to employee engagement, being mindful about being really focused in those efforts. So we're not asking, managers to do 10 new things, maybe focus on one or two things that are going to be most effective while also not overloading the manager. And the third takeaway that I wanted to bring up was a shift that organizations have been trying to explicitly make in the mentality around engagement. So several participants expressed the sentiment that there's a concern that among managers, the engagement score had been, they'd come to view it as kind of their rating of effectiveness as a manager. That's the target, how good is your engagement score? And so there's really been a push to rethinking that, to making sure that the mentality isn't that that's the end in itself. That's the starting point. So we use that as a metric, but then dig into it further through focus groups, interviews, whatever additional data we can get, and then do something about it. So then figure out what are the focused investments we can make to actually improve engagement. If the score in and of itself isn't the end, that should just be something to guide our initial efforts. And that, several organizations kind of emphasize that mentality that they're trying to shift as part of both addressing the issues with employee engagement, but also in attending to managers. So if we can hone in by collecting additional data on what the main issues with engagement are, we can identify the best one or two actions that managers can take versus saying kind of, here's an open-ended approach to how you can fix your employee engagement score.
Great. Thanks, Becca. Good first round of key takeaways. To those that are viewing this, I encourage you to submit some questions through the Q&A as well. We do have one, John, that I'm going to start with you on from Eileen here, who's asking, do you think the current attrition trends will impact the future of which industries or job roles will have the greatest need? And she adds, thinking from the perspective of those going into college and or looking to career changes. Any data there?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are the, industry level differences in attrition, which probably creates greater vacancies in some areas than others going forward. My sense, and I'm just sort of, forecasting here, just based on my own instinct, is that it seems like new entrants into the labor market right now, new college graduates in particular, are rethinking sort of what they want out of their careers. In the past, it was, the same issues are still important today, but I think geography played a huge role in the past, and maybe it's less so going forward. As just one example, we see students here who are thinking very broadly about what they want their lives to look like and what role they want work to play in that, and how they want that work to be structured, whether they want to be in a physical office or have more of a hybrid approach. So I think just the nature of the employment relationship is what's shifting, more so probably than what industry needs might be greatest, although that's happening simultaneously. So to me, it just feels like there's a major reset happening. We're in the middle of it, so I don't know what the end state will look like, but a reset in play as far as what the employee value proposition should look like or will look like for these new entrants. So those are just some top of head thoughts on that one.